Oh, hello there, dear. Don't mind me. Come on in. The door's open. I was just finishing a bit of mending. This old tablecloth has seen better days, but I can't bear to part with it. There's a comforting rhythm to this old sewing machine. You know, a steady worthump that's been a soundtrack to parts of my life for, goodness, 60 years or more. It's a sound that talks. If you know how to listen out there, let me put this away and I'll put the kettle on. Find a comfy spot. It's a bit gray out today, isn't it? The clouds are hanging low over the hills, looking full of unshed rain. A good day to stay in with a warm cup of tea and a story. This machine, it got me thinking. It's funny how a sound can be a key, isn't it? Unlocking doors in your memory you'd forgotten were even there. Most people see an old sewing machine, but I see a box of unsent letters, a bolt of midnight blue silk, and a promise I made to my mother that nearly broke my heart. It's the story of how I learned that love doesn't always use words, and sometimes the things we work the hardest for are not meant for us at all. To understand, you have to picture our little house back in 1965. It wasn't a quiet house then. Oh no, it was filled with the sound of the radio playing the platters, the smell of my mother's baking, and the constant, cheerful song of this very sewing machine. My mother, Eleanor, could make anything. She could turn a set of old curtains into a beautiful summer dress, or a scrap of flannel into a beloved toy for a neighbor's child. Her hands were never still. They were magic, and I was her apprentice. I'd sit beside her for hours, my own small hands clumsy with a needle and thread, trying to copy her neat, even stitches. "Patience, Aggie," she'd say, her voice as smooth and warm as honey. "Every stitch is a word in a story. You have to make sure you're telling a good one." That spring, the spring I turned 17, we started our grandest project. The graduation ball was the biggest event of our young lives, a shimmering fairy tale at the end of our school days, and my mother was determined I would have a dress worthy of a fairy tale, not some store-bought thing, but a creation. Our creation. After weeks of looking through her pattern books, we found it. It was a gown with a fitted bodice, a sweeping, bell-shaped skirt, and tiny seed pearls she planned to sew along the neckline. It was ambitious. It was beautiful. For the fabric, we took the bus into the city, a grand adventure in itself. We spent a whole afternoon in a fabric shop that seemed as big as a cathedral, filled with bolts of every color imaginable. And then, we saw it. It was a silk, the color of the sky just after the sun has set. A deep, midnight blue that seemed to hold all the stars in its threads. It was terribly expensive. My father, a man who worked hard for every penny at the motor garage, grumbled about the cost. But my mother just gave him a look, and he folded with a sigh and a rare smile. That bolt of blue silk became a sacred object in our house. It sat in my mother's sewing room, a shimmering promise of the future, a future filled with music and dancing, and a night so perfect it would become a story I'd tell my own children. We were going to start on it during the summer holidays. We had it all planned, but life, dear, has a habit of tearing up your plans without a word of apology. That summer, my mother got sick. It started as a tiredness she couldn't shake, a cough that wouldn't leave. The doctor came. Then there were trips to the hospital in the city. The cheerful hum of the sewing machine was replaced by a new sound, the worried, hushed whispers of adults in the hallway. My father's face, usually smudged with grease and good humor, became a gray, tight mask of fear. She was gone by the time the autumn leaves started to turn. Just like that, the light of our house went out. The silence she left behind was a physical thing. It pressed in on you, smothering the very air. Grief is a thief, you know. It doesn't just take the person you love. It takes the music from the radio, the smell of baking from the kitchen, the very sound of laughter from the walls. My father and I became two strangers living in the same house. He retreated into his work, leaving early, coming home late, his silence a fortress I couldn't breach, and I was lost, adrift in a sea of my own sorrow. The house was just a collection of rooms, and my mother's sewing room was the most painful of all. I kept the door shut for weeks. One rainy afternoon, I couldn't bear it anymore. I had to go in. The room was just as she had left it. Thimbles and thread and scraps of fabric lay on her work table, and in the corner, covered by a dust sheet, was the bolt of midnight blue silk. I pulled the sheet away, and the fabric shimmered in the gloom, like a deep, dark pool of water. It was a promise of a future that had been stolen from me, a dream that could never come true. I sank to the floor, my hand on the cool, smooth silk, and I cried for everything we had lost. And in that silent, lonely room, a new, desperate idea began to form. A promise I made, not to her, but to her memory. I would make the dress, alone. I would finish the story we were supposed to write together. In the days and weeks after my mother's passing, our house learned a new language. It was a language of silence, spoken in the careful click of a closing door, the scrape of a chair on the kitchen floor, the lonely clink of a fork against a plate. My father and I, we were fluent in it. He would leave for the garage before I was properly awake, leaving a few coins on the table for my lunch. He'd come home long after dark, smelling of oil and weariness, and sink into his armchair with the newspaper. He never looked at the paper, not really. He just held it up like a shield. I tried, in my clumsy, 17-year-old way, to bridge the silence. "How was your day, Dad?" I'd ask, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. "Fine," he'd grunt from behind the paper. "Did Mrs. Henderson bring the car in?" "Yep." "Did you fix it?" "Yep." Our conversations were a series of dead ends. I knew he was grieving. I saw it in the slump of his shoulders and the hollows under his eyes. But his grief was a locked room, and he had thrown away the key. I was locked out, left to navigate my own sorrow completely on my own. It was a terrible, isolating loneliness. I took over the running of the house. I learned to cook meals that were edible, if not exciting. I learned to wash and iron his work clothes. I became a small, efficient ghost, haunting the rooms where my mother's laughter used to echo. The house was clean, the meals were on time, but it was a house without a heart. My promise, the one I'd made to my mother's memory in the sewing room, became my secret anchor in that sea of grief. It was a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. After a month of keeping the sewing room door shut, I finally opened it for good. I spent a whole weekend just being in there. I touched her things, the pincushion she'd made, shaped like a tomato, her shears, heavy and cool in my hand. I sat at the sewing machine, my feet not quite reaching the treadle properly, and I remembered her hands guiding mine. Starting the project was the most frightening thing I'd ever done. The pattern looked like a secret code of lines and dashes. The midnight blue silk felt so precious, so unforgiving. One wrong cut and it would be ruined. My mother had made it all look so easy, so effortless, but for me, it was a mountain. I started with the paper pattern, carefully pinning the flimsy pieces to the silk. My hands were sweating. I took her heavy shears, the metal cold against my skin, and I made the first cut. The sound of the blades slicing through that perfect, pristine fabric was terrifying. It was a point of no return. The house's new silence was my ally in this. My father never asked what I was doing. I'd wait until he was settled with his newspaper shield, and then I'd slip into the sewing room and close the door. The whir thump of the machine was my accomplice. It was a quiet rebellion against the crushing silence. I'd talk to the machine. "You know," I'd talk to my mother. "Am I doing this right, ma'am?" I'd whisper into the gloom. "Is this seems straight?" The rhythmic response of the needle was the only answer I got, but it was enough. Some nights, it went well. I'd manage a long, straight seam, and a surge of pride would warm me. I'd feel her there with me, nodding her approval. But other nights were a disaster. I'd sew a sleeve on backwards, or the tension would be wrong and the thread would bunch up into a tangled, hopeless mess. Those nights, I would have to sit for hours with a tiny stitch ripper, painstakingly unpicking my mistakes, my eyes burning with tears of frustration. Each mistake felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of my mother's skill. During the day, at school, I was just as adrift. My friends were kind, but they didn't know what to say to the girl whose mother had just died. They'd talk about boys and music and plans for the future, and I felt a million miles away. Their lives were still in full, glorious color, while mine had been washed out in gray. One afternoon in the school library, a boy named Michael sat down at my table. He wasn't one of the loud, popular boys. He was quiet, like me. He had kind eyes and a slow smile. We started talking about books. He didn't treat me like I was fragile. He didn't offer clumsy words of pity. He just talked to me, like a normal person. It was like a window had been opened in a stuffy room. We started walking home from school together. He made me laugh, a sound that felt rusty and strange in my own throat. He told me about his plans to study architecture. He talked about the future as if it were a real, solid place you could walk into. He was slowly, gently, pulling me out of the gray fog of the past. And the dress, my secret project, started to feel less like a memorial to my mother and more like a bridge to my own life. A life that might, just might, still have some color in it. But the silence at home remained, a constant, heavy weight, and I still didn't know how to carry it. As winter thawed into a wet, hopeful spring, two things began to grow: my friendship with Michael, and the dress taking shape on the mannequin in the sewing room. Both were slow, tentative, and required a terrifying amount of faith. Michael was a balm to my bruised soul. He had a way of seeing the world that was so different from the turmoil inside my own head. He'd point out the way the light hit the leaves on a tree, or the funny pattern of the cobblestones in the old part of town. He saw beauty in the small things. He never pushed me to talk about my mother, but he created a safe space where I could if I wanted to. One day, I finally did. I told him about the dress, about my secret project. His eyes didn't fill with pity. They filled with a kind of gentle admiration. "That's an amazing thing to do, Aggie," he said, his voice soft. "Your mum would be so proud." His words were like water on parched earth. It was the first time anyone had said that, and hearing it from him made it feel real. It gave me new strength. It wasn't long after that, as we were sharing a bag of chips by the canal, that he asked me the question I had been both hoping for and dreading. "So, the graduation ball," he began, looking at his shoes. "I was wondering if you'd like to go with me." My heart did a funny little flip. To go to the ball, the magical night my mother and I had planned for, had seemed like an impossible dream. But with Michael, it felt possible again. It felt real. "I'd love that," I said, and the smile on my face felt genuine, not a mask I was putting on. Suddenly, my project had a real, solid deadline. The ball was in 8 weeks. The dress went from being a quiet memorial to a race against the clock. My evenings in the sewing room became more focused, more frantic. The bodice was done, a sleek, dark blue shell. Now I had to tackle the skirt. It was a full circle skirt, which meant yards and yards of that precious silk. It was the most difficult part of the whole design. The relationship with my father, however, remained as cold and distant as ever. The house was still a library of silence. He provided for me, he made sure I was safe, but we were like two ships passing in the night. He never once opened the door to the sewing room. He never asked what the constant, quiet hum from behind that door was. I think, in his own grief-stricken way, he couldn't bear to look at the part of the house that had been so completely my mother's. Her ghost lived in that room, and he wasn't ready to face her. His silence felt like a judgment. I imagined he thought I was foolish, playing with things I didn't understand. I imagined he disapproved of me trying to fill my mother's shoes, of touching her sacred things. The dress became a symbol not just of my love for my mother, but of the cavernous distance between me and my father. This whole period of my life, it was so insular, just me and my grief and this dress. It makes me wonder about all the other quiet battles people are fighting. By the way, dear, where are you watching from? What time is it there? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. It's nice to be reminded we're all out here, under the same big sky. Anyway, the skirt was a beast. I had to lay the fabric out on the living room floor, because it was the only space big enough. I spent a whole Saturday crawling around on my hands and knees, pinning the enormous paper pattern pieces, my back aching. My father walked through the room once, on his way to the garden shed. He stopped and looked down at the vast sea of blue silk, at me in the middle of it like a shipwrecked sailor. He didn't say a word. He just stood there for a moment, his face unreadable, and then he continued on his way. The silence he left behind was filled with my own insecurities. He thinks I'm going to ruin it, I thought. He thinks I'm not good enough. The frustration mounted. One night, I was trying to attach the heavy skirt to the delicate bodice. The weight of the silk kept pulling it, making the seam crooked. I stitched it, unpicked it, and stitched it again, 3 times. My fingers were sore, my eyes were burning. On the 4th try, the needle, my mother's old Singer needle, snapped with a sharp ping, embedding itself somewhere in the layers of dark fabric. A sob of pure frustration escaped me. I buried my face in my hands, defeated, and at that moment, the door to the sewing room creaked open. It was my father. He stood in the doorway, his work clothes still on, looking awkward and out of place. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his voice rough. "I'm fine," I snapped, my voice thick with unshed tears. "It's just, the needle broke." He walked over and looked at the dress on the mannequin, at the impossible swirl of the skirt. He reached out a calloused, grease-stained finger and gently touched the silk. It was one of the most tender gestures I had ever seen from him. "Your mother always had spare needles," he said, his voice quiet. "In the little tin box, the one with the forget-me-not on it," and then he turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. I sat there, stunned. He remembered the little tin box. It was a tiny thing, a crumb of connection, but to me, it felt like a lifeline. He was watching, he was listening, and he hadn't forgotten her, or me, after all. The small kindness gave me the strength to find the tin, replace the needle, and finish the seam. And this time, it was straight, with my father's small but significant acknowledgement, a tiny bit of the weight on my shoulders lifted. It wasn't a conversation, not really, but it was communication. It was a sign that he saw my struggle, even if he didn't know how to talk about it. Buoyed by that moment, I threw myself into the final stages of the dress with a renewed, almost feverish, energy. The ball was now only 3 weeks away. The dress was becoming a real thing of beauty. The sweep of the skirt was magnificent. When I put it on the mannequin, it looked like a captured piece of the night sky. All that was left to do was the hem, the zipper, and the most delicate part of all, the beading. My mother had bought a small bag of tiny, shimmering seed pearls. The plan had been for us to sew them on together, scattered across the neckline like a dusting of stars. Now, I had to do it alone. This was the part that scared me the most. It wasn't about skill with the machine. It was about patience and artistry. Each tiny pearl had to be attached with a single, invisible stitch. It was painstaking, eye-straining work. I'd sit for hours every evening, hunched under the light of a small lamp, the rest of the house dark and silent, carefully stitching pearl after pearl. My world shrank to the point of that tiny needle and the shimmer of the next pearl dot. My life took on a strange, dual quality. By day, I was a schoolgirl, walking with Michael, talking about exams and dreaming about the future. He'd ask about the dress, and I'd tell him it was coming along. He was so excited, so full of simple, uncomplicated joy about the ball. His happiness was infectious, but it also added to the pressure. I wanted the dress to be perfect for him, for my mother, for the memory of the dream we'd shared. But by night, I was a solitary artisan in a silent house, locked in a battle with a piece of fabric. The dress became more than just a dress. It was a vessel for all my unspoken emotions. Every stitch of grief for my mother, every pang of loneliness, every spark of hope for the future, every bit of frustration with my silent father, it all went into that dress. It was becoming heavy with the weight of my own heart. My father, for his part, continued his quiet observance. He never mentioned the tin of needles again, but I noticed small things. A flask of tea and a sandwich would appear by the sewing room door late at night. He started leaving the hall light on for me, so I wouldn't be working in a completely dark house. They were small, practical gestures, the only love language he knew. Back in my day, men like my father weren't taught to speak of their feelings. They were taught to provide, to fix, to do. His clumsy offerings were his way of saying, "I'm here." But I was a teenage girl, and I longed for words, for a hug, for an acknowledgement of the monumental effort I was making. His silent support felt like a ghost of what I needed. One evening, about a week and a half before the ball, I saw him standing in the hallway, just watching me through the open door. I was sewing the final stitches on the hem. He was holding a small, crumpled photograph. As he turned, I caught a glimpse of it. It was a picture of my mother, wearing a dress she had made for a wedding, laughing. The look on his face was one of such profound, bottomless loss that it took my breath away. He wasn't silent out of disapproval for me. He was silent because he was drowning, and seeing that, I felt a surge of love for him so fierce it hurt. But still, neither of us knew how to cross the chasm between us. He slipped the photo back into his pocket and disappeared into the living room. The night I finished the beading was a moment of pure triumph. I stepped back from the mannequin and looked at my creation. It was beautiful, truly beautiful. The pearls shimmered against the dark blue silk. The skirt fell in perfect, graceful folds. It was the dress from my mother's pattern book, the dress from my dreams. I had done it. I had kept my promise. A feeling of relief and pride so powerful washed over me. I felt light-headed. All that was left was the final press with the iron to get out any last wrinkles before the big night. The ball was on Saturday. This was Tuesday. I had plenty of time. I carefully laid the dress out on the ironing board. I filled the iron with water. My mother had always taught me to press silk on a low heat, with a pressing cloth to protect the fabric. I did exactly as I remembered. I laid the clean, white cloth over the bodice and began to press gently. Everything was going perfectly. I was almost done. And then, the unthinkable happened. As I lifted the iron, it snagged for a split second on a loose thread on the pressing cloth. It tilted, and a single, large drop of scalding, rusty water escaped from a steam vent and fell directly onto the pristine, perfect silk of the bodice. It left a dark, ugly, rust-colored stain, about the size of a shilling, right in the center. A permanent, unfixable stain. My beautiful dress, my masterpiece of love and grief, was ruined. I stared at the stain, my mind refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. The dark, rusty splotch on the perfect midnight blue was a hideous wound. It wasn't just a mark on fabric. It was a symbol of my failure. All those hours, all that painstaking work, all the hope and grief I had stitched into every seam, it all seemed to drain away, leaving me empty and sick. I tried everything. I dabbed it gently with a damp cloth, my hands shaking. The stain only seemed to mock me, settling deeper into the fibers of the silk. I thought of my mother, of her skilled, confident hands. She would never have made such a clumsy mistake. She would have known the iron was old, that its steam vents sometimes spat rusty water. I hadn't just ruined the dress. I had failed her. I had failed her memory. A wave of despair so bleak and powerful washed over me. It felt like I was physically breaking apart. All the grief I had been holding at bay, channeling into this project, came rushing back in a tidal wave. I let out a sound, not a cry, but a raw, wounded noise from deep in my chest. I snatched the dress from the ironing board, my creation, now a source of agony, and I shoved it into the bottom of my wardrobe, burying it under a pile of old jumpers. I couldn't bear to look at it. I slammed the wardrobe door shut and fell onto my bed, sobbing into my pillow until I had no tears left. The ball, Michael, the futurette, all meant nothing. My bridge to the future had collapsed. I must have cried myself to sleep. When I woke up, the house was dark and silent, save for the ticking of the clock downstairs. My head ached and my throat was raw. I felt hollowed out. The door to my bedroom creaked open, and the silhouette of my father stood there. "Aggie," he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "I heard you crying." This was it. This was the moment for him to comfort me, to tell me it was all right. I needed my dad, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't explain the magnitude of the disaster. How could I make him understand that it wasn't just a dress? "I'm fine," I mumbled into the pillow, the lie tasting bitter in my mouth. He came and sat on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped under his weight. He was so close, yet he felt a million miles away. He clumsily patted my shoulder, his hand heavy and awkward. "It's just a dress, Aggie," he said, his voice a low rumble. And those 5 words, meant to be a comfort, were the cruelest words he could have possibly spoken. Just a dress. He didn't understand. He didn't see the hours, the love, the memory, the promise. To him, it was just a piece of cloth. My last, fragile thread of hope snapped. He would never understand me. He would never be the father I needed. "Get out," I whispered, my voice shaking with a sudden, cold rage. "Just leave me alone." I felt him flinch, as if I'd struck him. He stood up without another word, and the mattress rose again. He walked to the door and paused for a moment before leaving, closing it softly behind him. The chasm between us was now complete. We were 2 strangers, sharing a roof, but living on different planets. His clumsy attempt at comfort had only proven how truly alone I was. The next few days were a blur of misery. I avoided Michael at school, mumbling excuses about not feeling well. How could I tell him I had ruined the dress? How could I explain that our magical night was cancelled because of a drop of rusty water? The shame was too great. I decided I just wouldn't go to the ball. I would pretend I was sick. It was easier than facing the truth. I came home from school on Thursday, 2 days before the ball, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. The house was empty. My father was still at work. I walked past the sewing room, its door slightly ajar, and I felt a fresh pang of grief. The whole house felt like a monument to my failure. I went into the kitchen to make a cup of tea. and as I passed the living room, I stopped dead. The door to my wardrobe was open, and the dress, my ruined, beautiful dress, was not buried under the jumpers. It was laid out carefully on my bed. My first thought was anger. He had gone into my room, into my wardrobe. He had taken it out, but then I saw it. The bodice, with its ugly stain, was lying next to the skirt, and beside it, laid out on a piece of clean brown paper on the bed, was something else. It was a piece of fabric, a small, perfect remnant of midnight blue silk, the exact color, the exact sheen, as my dress, and pinned to it was a note, written in my father's blocky, grease-stained handwriting. It said, simply, "A good mechanic knows you don't scrap the whole car for one bad part. You find a new one." I stared at the piece of fabric. Where had he gotten it? The shop in the city where we'd bought it was a 2-hour bus ride away. He worked from dawn till dusk. When could he possibly have gone? It hit me then. He must have driven there, after his long, grueling shift. He must have gone to find it for me. He hadn't seen just a dress. He had seen the broken part, and like the mechanic he was, he had gone out and found a replacement. He had seen my heart, and he was trying to fix it. The tears that came now were not tears of grief or frustration. They were tears of a love so overwhelming, it felt like my heart would burst. That piece of midnight blue silk on my bed was more than just fabric. It was a letter. It was a speech. It was every conversation we hadn't been able to have for the past year. It was my father's heart, laid bare in the only language he knew, the language of doing, of fixing, of providing, holding it. I understood everything. His silence hadn't been disapproval or indifference. It had been his own brand of quiet, helpless grief. He had been watching me, not as a judge, but as a fellow mourner, unable to find the words to comfort me because he couldn't find them for himself. His trip to the city to find that fabric was his clumsy, beautiful, perfect way of saying, "I see you, I love you, don't give up." I didn't wait. I flew to the sewing room, my heart suddenly light and full of purpose. I had less than 2 days. It was an impossible task, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. I felt my father's love beside me, and my mother's spirit guiding my hands. The work was terrifying. I had to perform surgery on the dress. Using my mother's sharpest stitch ripper, I painstakingly unpicked the entire bodice from the skirt. My hands, which had been clumsy with despair, were now steady with a new kind of determination. I carefully disassembled the ruined bodice, seam by seam, to use the pieces as a pattern. I laid them out on the new piece of silk, my father's gift, and I cut with a precision I didn't know I possessed. I sewed all through that night. The whir-thump of the machine was no longer a lonely sound. It was a hopeful heartbeat in the quiet house. I didn't talk to my mother this time. I talked to my dad, even though he was asleep down the hall. I told him thank you. I told him I understood. I stitched my love for him into this new bodice, just as I had stitched my grief into the old one. When my father came into the kitchen for his breakfast the next morning, I was already there, drinking a cup of tea, my eyes red-rimmed but shining. He looked at me, then at the closed sewing room door, and a small, almost imperceptible nod passed between us. No words were needed. The silence between us was different now. It was no longer a chasm of things unsaid, but a comfortable space of mutual understanding. That Friday, the day before the ball, was a whirlwind of activity. After school, I reattached the new, perfect bodice to the magnificent skirt. I restitched the zipper. Finally, I sat down to redo the most painstaking part of all, the beading. My fingers flew, sewing each tiny pearl onto the new neckline. It wasn't a chore anymore. It was an act of love, a final tribute to the three of us, my mother's dream, my father's love, and my own stubborn perseverance. Late that night, I sewed the final pearl. It was done. I put the dress on the mannequin and stood back, my whole body aching with exhaustion, but my heart soaring. It was perfect, more perfect than before, because now it told a bigger story, a story of loss, yes, but also of love, of hope, and of a father and daughter finding their way back to each other through the language of a needle and thread. The next day, Saturday, the day of the ball, the sun was shining. The world felt new. I carefully pressed the dress with a brand new iron my father had bought and left on the kitchen table that morning and hung it on my wardrobe door. It looked like a dream. That afternoon, a strange sound filled our quiet street, the frantic, clanging bell of a fire engine. I ran to the window. Black smoke was billowing into the sky from a few streets over. My heart leaped into my throat. Later, the news spread through the neighborhood. It was the miller's house. A faulty wire in the kitchen. The family had all gotten out safely, thank God, but the house was gutted. They had lost everything. My mind immediately went to Sarah Miller, the youngest daughter. She was 14, a quiet, sweet girl. I knew she had her own big event coming up in a few weeks, a regional music recital she'd been practicing for all year. She played the violin. I pictured her violin case probably saved, but her special recital dress, her clothes, her home all gone. I looked at the beautiful gown hanging on my door, my ticket to a perfect night, my symbol of a promise kept. And then I looked out the window at the lingering smoke in the sky, and I knew, with a certainty that was absolute, what the real story of this dress was supposed to be. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about the ball. Its journey wasn't over yet. It had one more story to tell. That evening, as Michael was due to arrive, I did something that must have seemed very strange. I took the beautiful midnight blue gown, my masterpiece, and I laid it carefully in a large box, lined with tissue paper. Then, I put on a simple knee-length dress I'd bought on sale a few months before. A perfectly nice dress, but not a fairy tale. When Michael knocked on the door, he found me standing there with the big box in my hands. He looked at my simple dress, then at the box, a confused but gentle smile on his face. "Is that the famous dress?" he asked. "It is," I said. "But I'm not wearing it tonight. We have to make a stop on the way to the ball." I explained my idea to him as we walked. We didn't walk towards the school hall, where the music was already starting to drift through the warm evening air. We walked towards the street where the fire had been. The Millers were staying with a neighbor. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, a grim reminder of the afternoon's disaster. I felt terribly nervous as I knocked on the neighbor's door. Mrs. Miller answered, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion. Her daughter Sarah was sitting on the stairs behind her, looking lost and numb. "Agnes," Mrs. Miller said, surprised, "shouldn't you be at the ball?" "I'm on my way," I said, my voice a little shaky. I heard about what happened, and I know about Sarah's recital. I wanted her to have this." I held out the big box. Sarah came down the stairs. Together, we opened the box. The midnight blue silk shimmered under the dim hallway light. Sarah gasped. She looked from the dress to me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It was supposed to be for my ball," I explained softly, "but I think its story isn't finished. I think it's meant to go to a recital and listen to some beautiful violin music." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and in her mother's, too. Sarah reached out and touched the fabric, just as my father had done. It was a gesture of pure reverence. "I can't," she whispered. "It's too beautiful." "Yes, you can," I said. "It was made with a lot of hope. It's supposed to be worn." We left the dress with them and walked back towards the school. The weight that had been on my shoulders for a year, the grief, the pressure, the need for perfection was gone. I felt light, free. Michael slipped his hand into mine. "That was the kindest thing I've ever seen anyone do, Aggie," he said. "And you know what? I had the most wonderful time at the ball. In my simple, store-bought dress, I danced every dance with Michael. I laughed with my friends. I wasn't the girl in the fairy tale gown, but I didn't need to be. The magic wasn't in the dress. It was in the freedom of letting it go. It was in the quiet joy of having a father who had driven across 3 towns for me, and in the shared smile with a boy who had a kind and gentle heart." Sarah wore the dress to her recital. I went to watch. She played beautifully, and under the stage lights, the dress seemed to come alive, the seed pearls glittering like real stars. It had found its true purpose. Its story was complete. "So you see, dear, that's the story this old sewing machine tells me every time I hear it sing its Worth Hump song. It tells me that grief is not a destination, but a journey, and that love speaks in 1,000 different languages. For some, it's in hugs and words. For my father, it was in a flask of tea, a remembered tin box, and a piece of midnight blue silk. You just have to learn to listen with your heart, not just your ears. And it taught me the most important lesson of all. Sometimes we pour our whole selves into creating something, a plan, a dream, a beautiful dress. We think its purpose is the one we've designed for it, but life has other ideas. The real value of the things we create isn't in their final destination. It's in the journey they take us on." The dress wasn't really about the ball. It was about mending a broken heart. It was about understanding my father. It was about keeping my mother's memory alive, not as a sad ghost, but as a force for creation and, eventually, for kindness. Its true purpose wasn't to be worn by me, but to be made by me. The things we make, the love we pour into them, it all ripples outwards. The story is in the stitches, every single one. Now, the rain seems to have stopped, and that kettle has been whistling its heart out. Let's have that cup of tea.